I didn't walk into that courtroom expecting mercy. I walked in expecting theater. Everyone already seemed to know their roles. The judge behind his bench, the clerk tapping her pen, the gallery whispering with the kind of appetite people reserve for someone else's downfall. And there I was, sitting at the petitioner's table in my dress blues, not because the court required it, but because I needed to remember the man I had been before all of this. Years of service, years of sacrifice, now reduced to a file stamped with the word divorce. Across from me sat my wife, polished, composed, and already living in the future she thought she had secured. Beside her was the man she had chosen to gamble it all on, a lawyer with slick-back hair, a suit that looked pressed by someone else's hands, and the easy arrogance of someone who believed the law was a weapon he alone could wield. He leaned back in his chair like this was already won. She mirrored his confidence with a small smirk, her manicured nails drumming against the table in rhythm with his certainty. It wasn't the sound of laughter that cut me. It was the glance they shared, a private joke carried on the curve of their lips. He whispered something, too soft for the room to catch, but clear enough for me to feel its aim. My wife tilted her head, smiled, and said just loud enough for me to hear, "He's too scared to even speak. Look at him." I didn't answer. My silence wasn't surrender. It was calculation. The lawyer slid a folder across the table toward me, his hand moving with the kind of casual authority that comes from years of winning before the fight even starts. "Sign it now," he said, voice smooth, unshaken, rehearsed. His eyes lingered on me, as if he was already picturing the headlines, already savoring the defeat he expected me to accept. I lower my eyes to the paper. Pages of clauses and numbers, typed with precision, designed to strip me bare. The house, the savings, even my truck. Every line carried the same message. I was to leave with nothing. For a moment, I let the silence do the work. The shuffle of papers behind me, the scrape of a chair in the gallery, the clearing of a throat near the clerk's desk, they all seemed louder in that stillness. I could feel my wife watching me, waiting for the crack, waiting for me to flinch the way she had predicted. But inside me, there was no breaking, only a quiet shift, a recognition of what this moment really was. This wasn't about property. This wasn't about money. It wasn't even about the vows already buried. It was about dignity. And dignity doesn't beg. It doesn't fight on someone else's terms. Dignity waits. I thought of the years before this, the deployments, the long nights, the sacrifices I had carried without question. I thought of the men I had stood beside, of battles where fear was real, but silence was survival. And here, in a courtroom filled with the echo of betrayal, I realized I wasn't afraid. I was simply watching. The judge glanced in my direction, expecting me to move, to reach for the pen. The lawyer's smile widened as though he could already taste victory. My wife shifted in her seat, confident enough to look away, already certain the next chapter of her life was secured. I leaned back slowly, the leather of the chair creaking beneath me. I met the lawyer's eyes and held them there. He expected desperation, maybe even rage. What he found instead was calm. "You really have no idea who I am," I said quietly, my voice carrying just enough weight to cut through the hum of the room. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't defiance. It was a truth, one they had never cared to learn. The lawyer tilted his head, smile faltering just slightly. My wife's eyes flicked to mine, a trace of unease crossing her expression before she looked away. The moment passed, small and unnoticed by the others in the room, but not by us. I didn't sign. I didn't move. I let the silence stretch until it became something they had to carry. The lawyer shifted in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks with forced precision. My wife crossed her legs, the click of her heel too sharp against the floor. In that stillness, I understood something I hadn't before. This hearing wasn't the end. It wasn't even the fight. It was the stage. And every performance reveals more than the actor's intent. The gavel struck lightly as the judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Walker," he said, voice steady, "either sign the agreement or state your objection." I kept my eyes on the man across from me, the one who thought my silence was fear. Then I shifted my gaze to my wife, who refused to meet it. And in that quiet breath before speaking, I felt the weight of what lay ahead settle into me, not as a burden, but as resolve. I straightened my jacket, the fabric pulling tight across my shoulders. "Your Honor," I said calmly, "I have an objection." The room shifted. Small movements, quiet whispers, but I felt the current change. The lawyer exhaled through his nose, dismissive. My wife's lips pressed thin, but I wasn't watching them anymore. I was watching the silence itself, the way it had turned from their weapon into mine. And as I stood there, I knew this. Dignity had no need for anger, no hunger for revenge. Dignity simply waited. And today, it had all the time in the world. 3 years earlier, if someone had told me I'd one day sit across from her in a courtroom, I would have laughed. Back then, she wasn't an opponent. She was the person I thought would never leave my side. I carried her photo through deployments, through sandstorms, through nights when I wondered if I'd make it home. To me, she was proof that something steady waited on the other side of the fight. To her, I would later realize I was a stepping stone, useful until something shinier appeared. It didn't happen suddenly. Betrayal rarely does. It begins in whispers, so quiet you convince yourself they're not there. First came the complaints. The hours were too long. The base assignments too boring. The friends too few. I chalked it up to transition. Civilian life is never easy after years of service, and I thought she simply needed time. But time didn't mend it. Time sharpened it. She wanted more. Not more love, not more stability, but more recognition. She liked the way people looked at her when I wore my uniform, the way introductions carried weight at events. She enjoyed being admired, envied even by other wives. What she didn't enjoy was the reality that behind every title, behind every ceremony, was the grind of everyday life. When I shifted to a desk role, the energy shifted with it. She said she felt trapped. She said the man she married wasn't the man sitting behind a computer all day. I heard the words, but I didn't believe their edge. I thought marriage could withstand boredom. I thought love could carry weight without applause. Then came the late nights. "Work dinners," she'd say. The phone calls answered in the garage, her voice dropping low when I stepped too close. The sudden obsession with her appearance, a new dress for every occasion, a new excuse for every absence. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe us. But belief is fragile when truth is already seeping through the cracks. The turning point wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even loud. It was a Tuesday, late in the evening, when I came home earlier than expected. The house smelled of wine. Soft music hummed from the living room, and on the chair where I usually toss my jacket sat another. Tailored, expensive, not mine. He was there. Not a shadow, not a rumor. There in my space, with a glass in his hand and a smile that carried no shame. He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He simply looked at me and said, "Guess you're home early, soldier." I remember the way my wife looked at me then. Not startled, not guilty. Almost detached. As though she had already moved her life forward and I was the one standing still. I didn't yell. I didn't demand explanations. In truth, what words could compete with what I was already seeing? Her silence told me more than any excuse could. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was complete. She had chosen him. And in choosing him, she had chosen to strip me of something far deeper than fidelity. She had stripped me of respect. That night, I drove aimlessly, the streets blurring past headlights I didn't notice. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I replayed every moment, the long nights I had defended her absence, the doubts I had silenced, the faith I had stubbornly carried. I had mistaken her distance for struggle, when it had been her escape route all along. Why him? I asked her days later, when the silence between us had stretched into something unbearable. She shrugged, eyes cold. Because he sees what you don't. Because he knows how to give me the life I deserve. The words weren't shouted. They weren't cruel in tone. They were matter of fact, that made them cut even deeper. From that day on, I understood something about betrayal. It isn't always about desire. Sometimes it's about ambition. Sometimes it's about finding someone who can feed the hunger for more, even if it means stepping on the person who once carried you. I didn't fight back then. Not with words, not with accusations. Instead, I let the silence linger. I packed a bag. I left the house to her, at least for the moment. She thought my retreat was weakness. She thought I was folding. But silence is never empty. Sometimes silence is the beginning of a plan. The months that followed were heavy with pretense. She paraded him openly, as though daring me to react. Friends looked at me with pity, some with judgment, as if endurance was cowardice. I stayed quiet, absorbing it all. I had faced battlefields where the odds were stacked against me, where the enemy thought the fight was already theirs. This was no different. Every insult, every smirk, every dismissal became part of the file I carried inside me. Not a legal file yet, a personal one. Proof that betrayal was not my shame to carry. Proof that when the time came, the weight of truth would not fall on me, but on them. And so, when I sat in that courtroom years later, listening to the low hum of whispers, watching him lean back in his chair, watching her smirk at my silence, I wasn't shaken. I wasn't broken. I was remembering the slow erosion of trust, the wine glasses on the table, the way she said he knew how to give her the life she deserved. What they didn't know was that I had learned something far more valuable. Life doesn't hand dignity to those who demand it. It belongs to those who endure, who wait, and who choose the moment carefully. The courtroom wasn't the beginning. It was the continuation of a choice I made that night I walked out. The choice not to fight in their arena, but in mine. And as the judge tapped his pen, waiting for me to speak, I already knew. Their laughter was just an echo of a story that had started long before this day. If you're enjoying the video, hit that subscribe button and drop your country's name in the comments. Betrayal doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, disguised as routine, until the moment you can no longer deny what's in front of you. For me, it was ordinary details that told the truth. The unanswered calls, the perfume I didn't recognize, the way she lingered in the mirror longer than before, as if preparing for someone else's gaze. I told myself stories to keep the peace. She's adjusting, I thought. It's just a phase. But deep down I knew. The weight in my chest wasn't suspicion anymore. It was certainly waiting for evidence. That evidence came in the simplest way. A door unlocked when it shouldn't have been. The glow of a lamp left on in the living room. Wine glasses on the table, two, not one. And his jacket draped casually over the back of my chair, as if my home was already his. I froze in the doorway. The air smelled of red wine and expensive cologne. She sat on the couch, legs crossed, a glass in her hand. He leaned beside her, confident, comfortable, unbothered. Neither of them scrambled. Neither tried to hide. They looked at me as if I were the intruder. He smiled, slow and deliberate. Guess you're home early, soldier. I didn't respond. My eyes moved to her, waiting for explanation, for something to anchor myself to. But she didn't flinch. She didn't even look guilty. She just stared back at me, expression flat, as if the life we had built together was already a story she had stopped telling herself. I wanted to shout. I wanted to demand answers. But words felt useless in that room. What did they give me that I didn't already see? Their silence was the confession. Their composure was the verdict. So I turned. I left the house, the sound of their laughter following me like a blade pressed into my back. That night, I drove for hours, the road blurring, the dashboard lights glowing against hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I thought of the nights overseas when I had promised myself she was the reason to keep going, the picture I carried folded in my wallet. And now that picture felt like a lie I had been too willing to believe. Days later, when I confronted her, the truth came not in apology, but in justification. Why him? I asked, my voice low, already knowing the answer. She didn't hesitate. Because he can give me what you can't. Because I deserve more than this. No remorse. No hesitation. Just calculation. Her words didn't break me. They clarified me. This wasn't about love. It wasn't even about passion. It was about ambition. She had chosen him not because of who he was, but because of what he represented, status, wealth, the kind of power she thought she could wear like a crown. After that, I stopped asking questions. I stopped trying to rescue something already buried. Instead, I began to notice things I had missed before. The way she'd withdraw during family dinners, her eyes always drifting to her phone. The sudden trips she claimed were conferences. The lies weren't clever. They didn't need to be. She knew I wanted to believe. I realized then that betrayal wasn't the act of that night. It had been happening long before, in small doses, in subtle withdrawals, in the way she had stopped seeing me as a partner and started seeing me as an obstacle. I left the house soon after, taking only what mattered. Clothes, a few photographs, the essentials. She thought it meant defeat. She thought my silence meant surrender. But silence is not the absence of strength. It is the preparation of it. Friends asked why I didn't explode, why I didn't expose her immediately. They didn't understand. I wasn't interested in messy arguments or temporary victories. I had lived long enough to know battles aren't always won with noise. Some are won with patience. Her lawyer, her new partner, became bolder after that. He called me directly once, his tone dripping with smugness. Do yourself a favor. Sign whatever she puts in front of you. You'll save yourself a lot of humiliation. I didn't answer. I simply hung up, letting his voice linger like a challenge. And in that moment, I understood what my path had to be. Not rage, not pleading, documentation, evidence, strategy. The same tools I had relied on in darker places, when survival depended not on force, but on foresight. The discovery wasn't just about her infidelity. It was about clarity, seeing not only who she was, but who I needed to become in response. The soldier in me had been trained for unfair fights. This was no different. And just like before, I would not walk into it unprepared. So I waited. I listened. I collected. And when I sat back in that courtroom later, listening to their quiet laughter, watching him lean back in his chair, I wasn't the man they believed me to be. I wasn't broken. I wasn't scared. I was ready. Revenge is never about the explosion. It's about the patience that comes before it. The quiet, deliberate gathering of threads until the weight of them can no longer be ignored. After I walked out of that house, after I listened to the hollow justifications and the smug laughter of the man she chose, I made a decision. I would not fight them on their terms. I would not argue in kitchens or shout across parking lots. My war would be quieter, more exact. The months that followed demanded discipline. On the surface, I played the role they expected. I signed nothing, but I appeared worn down, silent, almost beaten. Friends who once admired my resolve now looked at me with pity. She saw it as weakness. He saw it as victory. They mistook my silence for surrender. What they didn't understand was that silence is sometimes strategy. I began to build my case in the same way I had once prepared for missions. Piece by piece, carefully, without alerting the enemy. A friend from the Criminal Investigation Division owed me a favor. Over late-night coffee, I explained enough for him to understand without asking questions I couldn't answer. He nodded slowly, then leaned back in his chair. If you're serious, we'll need evidence they can't explain away. Hard proof, not just suspicion. I know, I said. That's why I'm asking. What followed was weeks of quiet observation. Bank statements traced to accounts she thought I'd never see. Withdrawals that didn't match her explanations. Receipts for dinners far from home. Airline tickets that told a story different from the one she shared with me. Every piece of paper, every line of numbers, became another brick in the foundation I was laying. But documents alone weren't enough. People forget that words betray more than actions. Over drinks, at dinners, in the comfort of believing no one was listening, they spoke too freely. My friend helped me set up a wire, clean, legal, and sharp as a blade. I still remember the first time I played the recording back. His voice filled the speakers, arrogant and unguarded. Don't worry, babe. The judge is my buddy. He'll sign whatever we put in front of him. We'll bleed him dry and toast to it in Cabo. Her laughter followed, light, practiced, the same sound she once used with me. He's too scared to fight back. By the time he realizes the house, the accounts, everything will be ours. I let the tape run until his voice returned. Even if he tries, I'll bury him. Trust me, I've done this before. Hearing those words, something settled inside me. Not rage, not anymore. Clarity. This was no longer about betrayal. It was about corruption. And corruption, when exposed to daylight, consumes itself. Each week, the file grew heavier. Screenshots of emails, photographs of vacations taken under the guise of conferences, testimony from friends she had burned with her carelessness. I spoke little, moved quietly, and waited. They believed the silence meant they had won. But in truth, it meant they were giving me time. There were moments of doubt, of course. Nights when the loneliness pressed hard against me, when the weight of it all felt unbearable. I'd sit alone in my apartment, staring at the walls, replaying her words. Because he can give me what you can't. Because I deserve more. I reminded myself that those words weren't about me. They were about her. People reveal themselves when they think no one is watching. I was watching now. Occasionally, I crossed paths with her in public. At the grocery store, once at a cafe. She carried herself taller, as if her victory was already etched in stone. She looked at me like I was invisible, and I let her. Invisibility is a useful weapon. Her lawyer boyfriend, though, was less subtle. He called once more, his tone dripping with the same arrogance as before. "You're wasting time, Walker. Just sign. Save yourself the embarrassment." I paused before answering. "You sure about that?" The silence on the line was brief, but I heard it. The first flicker of doubt. By the time the court date drew near, my file was thick, my evidence undeniable. I tucked the recorder into my briefcase, labeled the file Exhibit Z, and pressed my uniform one more time. Not for them. For me. A reminder that discipline wins where arrogance fails. The morning of the hearing, as I walked into the courthouse, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. This wasn't about winning back what I had lost. It was about showing them, and perhaps myself, that betrayal doesn't define the betrayed. It defines the betrayer. I sat at the table, hands folded, eyes steady. Across from me, he smirked, and she drummed her nails against the polished wood. The judge shuffled papers, indifferent, expecting the routine. The lawyer slid the settlement across the table, his confidence unshaken. "Sign it, soldier. Save yourself the humiliation." I almost smiled, because what he didn't know was that humiliation had already changed sides. I leaned back, calm, and looked him directly in the eye. "You really have no idea who I am, do you?" He frowned, shifting slightly in his seat. She turned toward me, her smirk faltering just enough to reveal the first trace of unease. I didn't pick up the pen. I didn't touch the papers. Instead, I let the silence stretch, heavy, deliberate. Because silence had carried me this far. And silence, I knew, was about to break them. The moment the judge called the hearing to order, the air changed. What had felt like smug confidence on their side shifted into something more fragile, though they didn't notice it yet. She leaned toward him, whispering with the easy grace of someone convinced the ending was already written. He smirked, nodded, and tapped the papers in front of me again. "Sign it, soldier. Let's not waste the court's time." I didn't move. My silence lingered until the judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Walker, either sign the agreement or state your objection." I rose slowly, the weight of my uniform pulling into my shoulders like an anchor. "Your Honor," I said, voice calm, "I do have an objection, and I have evidence to present." The lawyer scoffed, waving a hand toward me. "Your Honor, this is a transparent stall tactic. There's no new evidence on record. He's wasting everyone's time." I reached into my briefcase, pulled out the small digital recorder, and set it on the table. "Actually, there is. Submitted as Exhibit Z." For a beat, the room was still. Then whispers began, small ripples through the gallery. The clerk straightened in her chair, the judge's brow furrowed. He gestured. "Proceed." I pressed play. The lawyer's voice filled the courtroom, arrogant and unguarded. "Don't worry, babe. The judge is my buddy. He'll sign whatever we put in front of him. We'll bleed him dry and toast to in Cabo." Her laughter followed, unmistakable. "He's too scared to fight back. By the time he realizes the house, the accounts, everything will be ours." A gasp rippled through the spectators. My wife froze, eyes wide. The lawyer's face drained of color. I let the tape continue. "Even if he tries, I'll bury him. Trust me, I've done this before." The judge leaned forward, eyes locked on the lawyer. His voice was sharp, colder than I'd ever heard it. "Is that your voice, counselor?" The lawyer stammered, his confidence evaporating. "Your Honor, This is taken out of context. The gavel slammed. Mr. Cole, do not insult this court. This recording demonstrates clear collusion and misconduct. Bailiff, seize that device for evidence. 2 bailiffs stepped forward. One collected the recorder. The other moved subtly closer to the lawyer, just in case. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Even the air conditioner seemed too loud. My wife's smirk was gone. She glanced at me, searching for something, anger, maybe, or gloating. But all she saw was calm. The judge turned to me. Mr. Walker, this court will thoroughly review this evidence. For now, all asset transfer requests are frozen pending investigation. Custody arrangements will remain unchanged until further notice. I nodded, respectful. Thank you, Your Honor. What I didn't mention was the rest of what I carried. The photographs, the bank transfers, the email tying them both to offshore accounts. Those would come later. For now, the recording was enough. The first blow had landed. The lawyer leaned toward her, his whisper sharp but panicked. We need to settle before this escalates. If the judge pursues this, her reply cut through, low and defiant. Settle? We're not giving him anything. I heard it. I smiled to myself, because I already knew something she hadn't learned yet. This battle wasn't about what I could gain. It was about how much they would lose. The hearing ended earlier than expected. The judge ordered recess, his face still tight with anger, his eyes fixed on the lawyer who sat stiff, no longer leaning back in smug ease. The gavel fell once more, and with it, the illusion of their control shattered. As we stood to leave, she brushed past me, her perfume sharp, her words barely audible. You think this changes anything? I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. It already has, I said quietly. In the hallway, the whispers followed us. Reporters scribbled notes. Clerks murmured among themselves. And for the first time since this began, I felt the weight shift. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough to know the tide had turned. I walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon light. My father was waiting outside with the kids, their small hands waving when they saw me. I smiled, the first genuine smile in months, and waved back. Inside, I knew their world was collapsing. His career, her reputation, the judge's credibility, all unraveling, thread by thread, pulled by the arrogance of their own words. But this wasn't victory yet. This was just the reckoning, the moment the ground gave way beneath their feet. And as I held my children close, I understood something deeper. This fight had never been about revenge. It was about truth. And truth, once revealed, does not retreat. The soldier in me had learned long ago that some battles are won in silence. And in that silence, justice had finally begun to speak. The weeks that followed felt less like triumph and more like release. The courtroom no longer carried their laughter. The papers they had once slid across the table now carried the weight of suspicion, subpoenas, and investigations. What had begun as their confident game had unraveled into a mess they could not control. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I focused on the simple things I had nearly lost. Mornings with my children, evenings without tension, the quiet relief of knowing I'd held my ground with dignity. Justice doesn't arrive with parades. It arrives in the silence that follows truth. Her lawyer, the man who once leaned back with smug certainty, was no longer leaning anywhere. He had been pulled into side chambers for questioning, stripped of the authority he thought made him untouchable. His career, once polished, was now cracked. I heard later he faced disbarment, maybe even worse. The judge, his so-called ally, was under investigation too, his decades of service overshadowed by the arrogance of one careless friendship. And my wife, the woman I once carried in my wallet through deployments, was left standing in the ruins of her choices. Accounts frozen, car repossessed, a condo she thought was hers seized. Friends who once leaned close to her stories now kept their distance, their silence as sharp as any verdict. For me, the aftermath wasn't about what I gained. It was about what I reclaimed. Custody of my children, ownership of the home I had built, the chance to look in the mirror without feeling like a man undone. The court acknowledged it formally weeks later. the new judge reading the decision with steady eyes. In light of overwhelming evidence of misconduct, Mr. Walker is granted full custody of the children, sole ownership of disputed assets, and immediate dissolution of the marriage. Her hand shook as the gavel fell. I remember standing, buttoning my jacket, and walking past her. I didn't whisper threats. I didn't spit anger. I simply said, "No other choice, remember?" Because that was the truth. She had told me once I had no choice but to surrender. What she never understood was that my only choice was to endure, to wait, to let silence work. And silence had delivered. 2 months later, a letter came in the mail. Her handwriting was shaky, uneven, a shadow of the confidence she once carried. Inside was a single page, a request, not an apology. "I can't find work. I can't pay rent. Please, just enough to get me through until I find something. For the kids' sake." There was no acknowledgement of what she had done. No regret, no remorse. Just need. I held the letter for a long time. Then I slipped it into an envelope with a photograph I'd taken the weekend before. Me, the kids, my father, and my new partner smiling on the porch of cabin in the mountains. On the back, I wrote, "You were right. I had no choice. I chose to live well without you." I mailed it the next day. A mutual friend told me weeks later she had been evicted, living in a run-down motel at the edge of town. The woman who once demanded more was now sharing a room with strangers, surviving on what little she could make in cash. Meanwhile, I was finalizing a contract for a major security project overseas, work that would set my family up for years. The contrast wasn't something I celebrated. It was something I observed. Betrayal burns bridges, but more than that, it leaves you stranded on an island you set on fire yourself. She had made her choices. I had made mine, and life had written the outcome. In the evenings, I'd sit on the porch of that mountain cabin, the sound of my children laughing inside, the air cool and still. I thought often of silence, how it had carried me, how it had been mistaken for weakness, how it had revealed itself as strength. Justice, I realized, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet reclamation of a life you thought was gone. Sometimes it's walking away while the other person drowns in the weight of their own decisions. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need the world to see her collapse. What I needed, what I finally had, was peace. And as I watched the sun sink behind the mountains, I understood the lesson fully. Some battles are not about winning. They're about refusing to lose yourself in the fight. Hope you loved it. Smash that like, hit subscribe, and share your location in the comments.